full-on preparation for the Olympia in September, which is going to be in October this year. But yeah, I was thinking about a lot of stuff. You know, when we mentioned about doing jaywalking and contest season, as we come into the new season, I normally have been competing at the Arnold this time of year. Or the reason I retired, you know, there's a lot of different. You scared of, you know, Phil obviously came up and beat me. You know, times change, and you know, I never expected to compete as long as I did. Right? I always said that.
Number 7, Ed Corney. This time we're going back to the 70s, and we're going to talk about a man who made a name for himself on the Olympia stage. You may remember him from the iconic documentary Pumping Iron, none other than Ed Corney. Ed Corney was a force to be reckoned with in the 70s, competing against some of the biggest names in the sport. He placed second to Franco Columbu in the lightweight class, and it was clear that he was a serious contender for the Olympia title. He didn't just compete in 1975 and call it quits. No, he continued to compete well into the 80s. But as the years went on, it became clear that Ed was no longer the same man he once was. He had aged, and his physique wasn't quite what it used to be. His placings at the Olympia had dropped significantly, and it seemed like it was time for him to hang up his posing trunks. However, Ed Corney was not one to give up easily. In 1994, a new competition was introduced, the Masters competition. Many former bodybuilders came out of retirement to compete just for old time's sake. Ed was one of them, and he placed respectably, but it didn't stop there. In 1997, there was a new competition for bodybuilders over the age of 60. Ed was there once again, competing against men his own age. It was clear that time had taken its toll on his body, but he still had the fire in his eyes and the love of the sport in his heart. It's hard for fans to remember Ed Corney in his prime when they see him in the later stages of his career. The man who was once a dream wrapped in a blanket was now a shadow of his former self. But we must remember that he was still out there doing what he loved and competing with men half his age. Finally, in 1998, at the age of 65, Ed Corney decided to call it quits. His body could no longer keep up with the demands of the sport, and it was time to retire for good. May he rest in peace, but his legacy lives on. Number 6, Rich GASPARI. GASPARI was a true powerhouse on the Olympia stage in the 80s, giving legendary bodybuilder Lee Haney a run for his money. He placed third in 1985, and then went on to secure second place in the next 3 consecutive years. However, as the years went by, GASPARI's placings began to slip. By 1991, he had dropped to 10th place, and it was clear that his time at the top was coming to an end. But GASPARI was not one to give up easily. He continued to compete well into the 90s, despite the fact that the competition in the IFBB was stronger than ever. You could see the wear and tear on his body, and it was almost sad to see such a once great bodybuilder struggle to keep up. GASPARI finally called it quits in 1996, but by this point, it was too late. He could no longer qualify for the Olympia, and it was clear that his body had taken a beating from years of intense training and competition. It's a shame to see a bodybuilding legend like Rich GASPARI continue to compete past his prime. He was once a serious threat to the Olympia title, but by the end of his career, he was barely hanging on. It's a reminder that sometimes it's better to retire gracefully than to continue on past your prime. In conclusion, Rich GASPARI's bodybuilding career was a roller coaster of highs and lows. While he achieved great success in the 80s, his career ultimately went on for too long, and his body suffered as a result. Number 5, NASSER Al-Sonbati. NASSER Al-Sonbati. He was a beast of all beasts, known for his massive size and incredible strength. When he first started, NASSER was aesthetically pleasing with a tiny midsection, but he decided to push the limits, and he ended up ballooning up to 300 pounds of solid blockbuster muscle. He had a stellar career, pushing the likes of Dorian Yates and securing second place in 1997. By 1999, NASSER slipped down to 6th place, but his fans forgave him because he had just won the Arnold Classic. We were all excited to see him make a comeback in 2000, but it was clear that he wasn't the same NASSER. He looked a little small in the upper body and thicker in the midsection, taking 5th place. In 2001, he tried to make a comeback and showed up huge, but the judges saw something suspect in his delts, and he ended up in 9th place. In 2002, NASSER looked all but good. His best days were far behind him, and it seemed like it was time for him to call it quits. However, like a true soldier, NASSER continued to compete, pushing himself to the absolute limit. In 2005, NASSER was still at it, but it was clear that his physique was a shell of its former self. His once massive size had shrunk, and he was no longer the unstoppable force he once was. Number 4, Paul DILLET. Paul DILLET, back in the mid-90s, nobody could touch him when it came to size. He was a beast among men, and his muscular T was almost unbeatable. However, as time went on, Dillet's best years were behind him. By 2000, he was no longer the same bodybuilder that fans had come to know and love. He brought a sad look to the stage, and it was clear that his body was not what it used to be. By 2003, things had only gotten worse. Dillet's once massive physique had dwindled down, and it was almost sad to see him on the stage. We must remember that this is not meant to disrespect Dillet or any other bodybuilder who has continued to compete past their prime. It's just a fact of life that sometimes our bodies can't keep up with the demands we place on them. Despite this, Dillet continued to compete, and in 2006 he decided to call it quits. Number 3. Dennis Wolf. Dennis Wolf, and he was a true stud on the Olympia stage back in 2007. He took 5th place, and it was clear that he was a force to be reckoned with. In 2013, Wolf was still going strong, securing 3rd place at the Olympia. His physique was still impressive, and it seemed like he had many good years ahead of him. However, by 2015, he had seemingly called it quits, and it was a great career for him. But then in 2018, Wolf made a return to the bodybuilding stage. It was at the Arnold Classic Australia and then the Straight Up Arnold Classic. Unfortunately, he did not place very well at either venue, and it was clear that his best years were behind him. While Wolf doesn't necessarily belong on our list of bodybuilders who competed way too long, it's still a reminder that sometimes it's best to retire gracefully and remember the athlete in their prime. Number 2. Victor Martinez. His name is Victor Martinez, and he was a force to be reckoned with back in the early 2000s. By 2007, his career had culminated in an impressive win at the Olympia, although some fans argue that he defeated Jay Cutler. Despite his early success, Martinez continued to compete, and he still looked incredible. However, by 2010, he had fallen to 8th place, and by 2013, he was no longer placing in the top 10. Even though he still looked tremendous, it was clear that his best years were behind him. Martinez continued to compete, taking 9th place in the Arnold Classic in 2020, and even securing a victory over some decent bodybuilders. However, it was clear that his past victories and near Olympia win are the highlights of his career. So did Victor Martinez compete way too long in bodybuilding? No, not necessarily. As long as he calls it quits now and doesn't continue to compete, he can still be remembered for the incredible athlete he once was. Number 1. ROELLY WINKLAAR. Lastly, let's talk about current competitor ROELLY WINKLAAR. For many young fans, he's one of the favorite bodybuilders in the sport's history. In 2018, he was an uncrowned Mr. Olympia, although he officially placed 3rd. In my opinion, that was the peak of his career. He's still competing, and even though he's past his 40th birthday, he's still trying to make a comeback. Unfortunately, WINKLAAR has not been placing well in recent competitions, even finishing 9th in a small show like the Romania Muscle Fest Pro. While he's knocking on the door of being a bodybuilder who competed too long, he still had a great career. It's important to remember that these comments aren't meant to be disrespectful to any of the bodybuilders we've discussed. Instead, it's important to remember them in their prime and not when they've gone too far. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.